Hello and welcome to Creative Writing. I am Armin Rose and I will be your guide as we go through the concepts of this course. This is Part 8, the most common literary devices in narratives. Irony. Irony is a figure of speech in which words are used in such a way that their intended meaning is different from the actual meaning of the words. It may also be a situation that may end up in quite a different way than what is generally anticipated. In simple words, it is the difference between the appearance and the reality. Types of irony. A verbal irony involves what one does not mean. When in response to a foolish idea, we say, "What a great idea!" It is a verbal irony. A situational irony occurs when, for instance, a man is chuckling at the misfortune of the other even when the same misfortune, in complete unawareness, is befalling him. In dramatic irony, the characters are oblivious of the situation, but the audience is not. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, we know much before the characters that they are going to die. Examples of irony in real life. I posted a video on YouTube about how boring and useless YouTube is. The name of Britain's biggest dog was Tiny. You laugh at a person who slipped stepping on a banana peel, and the next thing you know, you slip too. The butter is as soft as a marble piece. Oh great! Now you've broken my new camera. Examples of irony in literature. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 5. Go ask his name. If he be married, my grave is like to be my wedding bed. Juliet commands her nurse to find out who Romeo was, and says if he were married, then her wedding bed would be her grave. It is a verbal irony because the audience knows that she is going to die on her wedding bed. The function of irony. Like all other figures of speech, irony brings about some added meanings to a situation. Ironical statements and situations in literature develop readers' interests. Irony makes a work of literature more intriguing and forces the readers to use their imagination and comprehend the underlying meaning of the text. Moreover, real life is full of ironical expressions and situations. Therefore, the use of irony brings a work of literature closer to life. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a way of indicating or hinting at what will come later. Foreshadowing can be subtle, like storm clouds on the horizon, suggesting that danger is coming, or more direct, such as Romeo and Juliet talking about wanting to die rather than live without each other. Sometimes authors use false clues to mislead the reader. These are called red herrings, and they often appear in mystery writing. The function of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing adds dramatic tension to a story by building anticipation about what might happen next. Authors use foreshadowing to create suspense or to convey information that helps readers understand what comes later. Foreshadowing can make extraordinary, even fanciful events seem more believable. If the text foreshadows something, the reader feels prepared for the events when they happen. Creating foreshadowing. Give the reader direct information by mentioning an upcoming event or explaining the plans of the people or characters portrayed in text. In Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, as the Lincolns rode to Ford's Theater on 10th Street, John Wilkes Booth and 3 conspirators were a block away at the Hendron House. Booth had devised a plan that called for the simultaneous assassinations of President Lincoln Secretary of State Seward, and Vice President Johnson. Having learned that morning of Lincoln's plan to attend the theater, he had decided that this night would provide their best opportunity. Creating foreshadowing. Place clues in the first few sentences of a story or chapter to indicate the themes that will be important later. In Amy Tan, Rules of the Game. I was 6 when my mother taught me the art of invisible strength. It was a strategy for winning arguments, respect from others, and eventually, though neither of us knew it at the time, chess games. Creating foreshadowing. Portray characters' subtle reactions to objects in their environment to show that those objects might play an important role in the upcoming action. In Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, the men stood together, away from the pile of rocks in the corner, and their jokes were quiet and they smiled rather than laughed. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his closest brother. Creating foreshadowing. Use changes in the weather or mood to hint at whether good or bad fortune will follow. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, the night was still. I could hear his breath coming easily beside me. Occasionally there was a sudden breeze that hit my bare legs, but it was all that remained of a promised windy night. This was the stillness before a thunderstorm. Foreshadowing tip. Foreshadowing often appears at the beginning of a story or chapter. Keep an eye out for signs of potential conflict between characters. Look for signals that things might not be what they initially seem. Pay close attention to any details that seem unusual or have particular emotional significance. These might be clues about what is to come. Flashback. In literature, a flashback is an occurrence in which a character remembers an earlier event that happened before the current point in the story. The definition of flashback is identical to that of analepsis, which comes from the Greek for the act of taking up. There are two types of flashbacks: those that recount events that happened before the story started, which is an external analepsis, and those that take the reader back to an event that already happened but that the character is considering again, called an internal analepsis. Examples of flashbacks in real life. Many of us have flashbacks quite frequently. We may have flashbacks when we think of someone whom we haven't thought of in a while and remember some memory of that person that he was a part of. Or we may look at an object and think of when we first got it or why it's significant. Lots of different things in our daily lives can trigger flashbacks, and we are not always aware of it. Example of flashback in literature from 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses, built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point. This is an example of flashback that occurs at the opening line of a novel. In fact, the first line of Gabriel Garcia Marquez' The 100 Years of Solitude is one of the most famous opening lines in all of literature. In it, we meet one of the central characters of the book, Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and know some important factors about him right away. We know that later in the book he will face a firing squad, and we also know that his life seems to predate history. Garcia Marquez does an interesting job here of spanning many decades in just a few short words, and setting up tension and curiosity on the part of the reader. The functions of flashback. Authors use flashback in their works for many different reasons. One key reason is to fill in elements of one or more characters' backstories. Flashbacks can help the reader understand certain motivations that were otherwise unclear or provide characterization in other ways. Flashbacks can also create suspense or add structure to a story. Some authors have chosen to tell their stories entirely in flashback, such as in Homer's Odyssey, in which Odysseus tells his story to a listener. Other authors, like Kurt Vonnegut and Slaughterhouse-Five, choose to tell their stories completely out of chronological order. Thus, it's more ambiguous where the present moment really is, and thus it's harder to say what is flashback, what is present, and what is flash forward. Flash forward. A flash forward in literature is a scene that takes place chronologically after the current action and shows what is to come. Flash forward examples can be real, imagined, projected, or expected scenes that will happen later. The definition of flash forward is the same as that of prolepsis, which means to anticipate in the original Greek. Flash forward versus foreshadowing. Flash forwards and examples of foreshadowing are similar in concept, though have very different functions. A flash forward shows an actual occurrence, often complete with scenery, dialogue, and so on. Foreshadowing, on the other hand, refers to clues that an author gives about what will happen later. Foreshadowing does not include a depiction of the complete scene, but just a sense of a theme that will reoccur, highlighting a minor character who will later become important, or dropping a few hints about how a conflict will be intensified or resolved. Examples of flash forward. Several television series also made extensive use of flash forwards, such as the following: How to Get Away with Murder, 6 Feet Under, Breaking Bad, Damages, and Lost. Example of flash forward in literature. In Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, Billy is spastic in time, has no control over where he is going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He is in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he is going to have to act in next. Billy Pilgrim is the protagonist, and Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is set loose in time and visits scenes from earlier and later in his life. As the excerpt above shows, Billy doesn't have any control which part of his life he will live next. This is an interesting example of flash forward because time is dismantled as a structural tool and the reader is unmoored from any sense of the present. The function of flash forward. Flash forwards are generally only found in certain genres. There must be an element of flexibility when it comes to time and chronology in a narrative that features flash forwards. None of us is able to see into the future so perfectly as to understand exactly what will come to pass, and neither would we trust a standard narrative that would alter the rules of time so as to show exactly what the future will look like. Instead, examples of flash forward are found in some science fiction stories and novels that deal in the supernatural. Some postmodern novels also use flash forwards to challenge the traditional structure of the novel. Motif. A motif is an object or idea that repeats itself throughout a literary work. Motif versus theme. In literary work, a motif can be seen as an image, sound, action, or other figures that have a symbolic significance and contributes toward the development of theme. Motif and theme are linked in a literary work, but there is a difference between them. In a literary piece, a motif is a recurrent image, idea, or a symbol that develops or explains a theme, while a theme is a central idea or message. Motif versus symbol. Sometimes, examples of motif are mistakenly identified as examples of symbols. Symbols are images, ideas, sounds, or words that represent something else and help to understand an idea or a thing. Motifs, on the other hand, are images, ideas, sounds, or words that help to explain the central idea of a literary work or the theme. Moreover, a symbol may appear once or twice in a literary work, whereas a motif is a recurring element. Example of motif in literature. In Mark Twain's The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn, we see several motifs that support the central idea of the narrative. The motif of childhood gives the novel a lighter tone and makes it enjoyable to read despite its grave central idea, which is slavery and racism. Both Huck and Tom are young and flexible enough to undergo a moral education, and thus are more open-minded than adults. Other obvious motif in narrative is superstitions. Jim appears silly to believe in all sorts of signs and omens, but interestingly predicts the coming event. Function of motif. Along with presenting a prevailing theme, writers include several motifs in their literary work as reinforcement. Motifs contribute in developing the major theme of a literary work and help readers to comprehend the underlying messages that writers intend to communicate to them. Symbolism. Symbolism is the use of symbols to signify ideas and qualities by giving them symbolic meanings that are different from their literal sense. Forms of symbolism. Symbolism can take different forms. Generally, it is an object representing another to give it an entirely different meaning that is much deeper and more significant. Sometimes, however, an action, an event, or a word spoken by someone may have a symbolic value. For instance, smile is a symbol of friendship. Similarly, the action of someone smiling at you may stand as a symbol of the feeling of affection which that person has for you. Examples of symbolism in everyday life. The dove is a symbol of peace. A red rose, or red color, stands for love or romance. Black is a symbol that represents evil or death. A ladder may stand as a symbol for a connection between the heaven and the earth. And a broken mirror may symbolize bad luck. Example of symbolism in literature from William Shakespeare's As You Like It. All the world's a stage, all the men and women merely players, and they have their exits and their entrances, and one man in this time plays many parts. The above lines are symbolic of the fact that women and men in course of their life perform different roles. A stage here symbolizes the world, and players is the symbol for human beings. Function of symbolism. Symbolism gives a writer freedom to add double levels of meaning to his work, a literal one that is self-evident and the symbolic one whose meaning is far more profound than the literal one. The symbolism, therefore, gives universality to the characters and the themes of a piece of literature. Symbolism in literature evokes interest in readers as they find an opportunity to get an insight of the writer's mind on how he views the world and how he thinks of common objects and actions, having broader implications. The ideas discussed in this video are based on the content standards of the Department of Education. Thank you for watching and see you in the next lesson.